everyone. Amy Goyer here. I am AARP's family and caregiving expert, and I want to welcome you to our chat today. We have a very special guest with us today, and what we want to discuss is a really frustrating caregiving situation where actually two caregiving situations. Whether you're frustrated because someone you're caring for is resisting care, or if they're demanding too much. We kind of have both ends of the spectrum. Both of these things can be very frustrating and difficult. So we're going to talk about some really practical ways to understand the situation and how to deal with these common tricky things. If you're not already watching us from the AARP Family Caregivers Discussion Group on Facebook, please do so. Be sure and join us there. Just go to Facebook and look for AARP Family Caregivers Discussion Group. I want to introduce my wonderful guests today. These are old friends of mine who I've worked with for many years, and they're wonderful authors. Dr. Julia Mayer and Dr. Barry Jacobs. Dr. Mayer is a clinical psychologist working in Medea, Pennsylvania, who specializes in working with women and has a growing focus on supporting caregivers, and is a co-host of a podcast on psychology and social justice, and is co-author of articles and books about caregiving and relationships with her husband, Dr. Barry Jacobs, our other guest. And Dr. Jacobs is also a clinical psychologist and a family therapist, and he works with caregivers and care receivers in private practice also in Pennsylvania. And he writes a long-running self-help column for caregivers on the AARP website. Together, they have just released a new book, and we're very excited. It's a new AARP book called the Caregiver Answers Book. Barry and Julia, thank you so much for joining me again.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Amy.
Great. We're going to get into talking about your book a little bit later, but I always start my conversations, as you know, asking my guests, what's your personal experience with family caregiving? Because family caregivers across the country are watching this, and we want to know, where you're coming from. So, Barry, do you want to start?
Sure, Amy. So I grew up, while I was a teenager, my dad had brain cancer and eventually died. And it had a big impact on me and my family. I learned at a very early age, actually around 15 when my dad died, that illness does not happen to individuals. It happens to families as a whole. And I went on, was first a journalist, but later became a psychologist, and it became a psychologist focusing on the needs of families dealing with serious and chronic illness. And then in my 50s, Julie and I took care of my stepfather and mother, both of whom had dementia. We did that for about 7 years, and we learned a heck of a lot during those 7 years, much more so than I knew before then.
Yeah. Julie, do you want to add to that?
Yeah. Before we took care of Barry's mother and stepfather, my mother died suddenly when I was in my 40s, and she had been my dad's caregiver. He had vascular dementia, and so she died suddenly, and my siblings and I had to jump in and take care of him, which we did. And we can talk more about that if we have time. But then after he passed away, a few months later, we began care for Barry's mother and stepfather. So it's like over a 10-year period that we did a lot of caregiving.
Yes, I know. You've had a lot of varied experiences. And so thank you so much for sharing those experiences and for helping other caregivers. And to that end, today we want to talk about these two kind of caregiving scenarios that are what I think of kind of the other two ends of the spectrum. Either people who just absolutely refuse care, or who just want everything, who we feel are so demanding. So first, let's dive into the first one. If we've got family members and friends who, for example, resist making changes to their home to make it safer, or resist having someone come in and help them, or making a change in their living situation. This is such a common topic among family caregivers, and it's very common in our Facebook group. So does that come up a lot in your practices?
Absolutely. I think a lot of care receivers have spent their lives making their own decisions, doing things their way. And when they get to a point where they need care, they really don't want to change that part. So there are plenty of caregivers who resist when their adult children, let's say, come in and say, oh, we need to get rid of some of this furniture. We can't have that area rug. We don't want you to trip. You're using a walker now. And, the care receiver might say, well, I love that rug and I want to keep that rug and I've had it for 20 years and it's meaningful to me to have it. So, let out.
Yeah.
So I think it always helps to think about what the care receiver is going through when you're trying to help them, because there are lots of ways to ask them to make changes, but being pretty harsh or direct or adamant about it, often you get, as much as you push, you get the same amount pushed back.
I think that's one of the hardest things is knowing how to approach it because as caregivers, we look at the situation and we're like, well, you're not safe. So this makes sense. Why would you want to keep driving if you're not safe? Well, if you're, it doesn't matter how old you are, your wheels are your independence. So it doesn't matter that you're 90 years old. You know what the change means in your life. Like you say, that rug that means so much to a person, or that the symbol. I think the symbolism is part of it, don't you, Barry? Like the symbolic letting go means I'm going downhill.
Yeah, I think for many folks, it feels like they're entering a new phase of life that they don't want to enter, one where they lose their independence and they're more dependent on other people for driving, say, or have other people come in and rearrange their homes. And it feels like a real intrusion. It feels like they're losing who they are. And so people resist it. And it's understandable. On the other hand, particularly, we dealt with this with my mom, who was extremely resistant to care, and it left, I'm going to speak not so much for Julie, but for myself. I was extremely frustrated with her, so much so that I would sometimes lose empathy for her. I couldn't understand why she was giving me such a hard way to go when I was working so hard to help her. And Julie would often point out to me, well, it's because your mother is really feeling a sense of loss.
Yeah.
And so I needed that to keep that perspective in mind, even while, as you point out, we're trying to keep my mom safe, because my mom wasn't always safe. She wouldn't use her walker. She would fall. I would come into her apartment. I would find her on the rug, on the floor, where she had been for hours, and no one had. Wasn't unable to pick herself up.
And that's a situation we hear a lot. Well, those things happen, and yet they still don't want to wear their medical alert device, their pendant or their wrist device or so you have to try and find various ways to approach it. Julia, do you want to start with how do you approach it? You've clearly mentioned empathy, understanding what this means to a person to let go, trying to get into their shoes.
Yeah, and remember that they have grief because they're losing things all the time. They're losing their sense of self, they're losing their self-efficacy, they're losing maybe their car, maybe their rug, all sorts of things that they define themselves with. So, yes, you start with empathy. And then I think what you want to do is join them. You want to say, well, I know you don't want to stop driving. It's been one of the most important things in your life. I understand that. But I worry about you. And, you could take care of me a little bit by not driving, because then I don't have to worry about what happens to you on the road when I'm not there. I worry about you all the time. I need your care. And so one way to sort of switch it around is to point out that they can help you if they're willing to cooperate.
Yeah, I've had some success with that myself with my parents. Say, we were in a situation where that mattered to them. They didn't want me to have more stress, and sometimes that's not the case. But that's one really good approach. So we've talked about empathy. We've talked about understanding that they're grieving and having a lot of losses in their lives of all sorts, whether losing control of their body or their environment or losing all their loved ones and their peer group. And then this thing of, well, how about helping me? What other tips do you have, Barry? You want to add some?
Sure. So I have found that if you could get someone to accept something small, anything small, then they're more likely to accept other things. So A conversation I'll often have with older adults who are resistant to care. I'll say, well, did you ever have someone mow your lawn for you? Or did you ever hire someone to come in and clean? And oftentimes the answer is yes. And so I would say, well, why would it be different now? If you need someone to come in and help clean, why wouldn't you have someone come clean? Why is it suddenly a point of pride for you when it wasn't before? And try to help them accept even some small things. The more small things they accept, then the more large things feel okay to accept. And so you have to start small. It's like the adult child has to figure out, well, if I bring them over dinner once a week, will that be okay? And then will that then allow me to maybe go shopping for them and make dinner 3 times a week? But you have to start really slow so you're not overwhelming them with change.
Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that they have pride in being independent. So if they agree to do one thing, it kind of lessens the issue of pride, and they can get more comfortable. And it's certainly also habit, that you can expand what you're doing. But it is gradual and therefore sometimes very frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I read an article recently or heard someone telling the story that their loved one was resisting having someone care for them, and it was a loved one who had dementia. And so her husband found a young woman who, was a paid caregiver, but somehow he introduced them kind of as a new friend. And then the person was never talked about as a caregiver. This was her friend, and her friend would say, "Hey, do you want to go have tea tomorrow? Do you want to go do this, do that?" And this was a person who was still higher functioning dementia, but it worked beautifully. And they said for several years, they were just friends doing something together. And so that's another kind of way to approach it.
Yeah, that's a great example, Anita. And one of the things that points out is that, unfortunately, sometimes older adults may be very resistant to family members helping them. But when somebody new comes in, they may be on their best behavior. They may be more polite, in fact, than they are to their own adult children,
Right.
and be more accepting. They may not want to reject somebody's offers of help because they don't want to offend them, where they have no thought, no second thoughts about doing that to their son or daughter.
Barry's mother was like that. She did not want Barry helping her. But then when we brought in a caregiver, she knew the person was a caregiver, but she would take them out to lunch. She would take them for walks. She really enjoyed them in a way that she couldn't really enjoy us.
Accept it from family. Yeah. I think that's and sometimes when you're trying to introduce the topic of getting more assistance, it's sometimes better coming from an objective person, so not the family member. So it might be, sometimes we talk about getting someone to come in and do an in-home assessment of needs, and that person could be a nurse, or it could be some person who's qualified, where they may not see you as qualified as a family member, right? And sometimes they take it better that way, I think. Yeah.
I mean, we certainly faced that too. My cousins insisted that we get a geriatric care manager to come do the assessment of my mother and stuff. And I felt rather insulted. I mean, I kind of knew the score, but in retrospect, I think they were right. And as you point out, an outsider sometimes has a little bit more latitude to bring up things than family members do.
I did that with my parents. And, you and I have been working in this field for many years, and it's not that my parents didn't respect me, but I had a geriatric care manager come in and do an assessment in the home to reinforce the things that I knew they were going to say. And when my parents really responded to that, and, they were not super resistant. I don't want to paint the wrong picture. My parents were actually really easy to work with, but it's still, I think, can be helpful to do that. Any other tips on helping with those resistant family members?
I have one more, which is sometimes the family member is so resistant, and not just resistant, but hostile, angry, aggressive.
Uh-huh.
And you still, as a caregiver, may be on the mission to take care of them. That's where you have to acknowledge, I can change myself, but not them. So I can be mindful. I can do some breathing before I walk in the room. And if she yells at me or blames me or accuses me, I can do my best to understand that this is a suffering person. This is a person who's been altered. It's not really about me. And I can try to limit my sort of my perspective to what do I need to do, and how can I do it, and hold on to my compassion even though this person is not appreciative and may even be hostile.
I think that's one of the critical things. And as psychologists, you're really good about this is how that frustration that's building up inside. And sometimes you're so burned out and you're so exhausted and you're so frustrated that it comes out and you're yelling at the person and this and that. How do you get a hold of yourself to control that?
Well, you have to anticipate every day that that could happen, especially if you're in a really tough situation. You need to talk to people. I know Barry and I would talk to each other when his mother would get very frustrating. And other caring people, you try to share it with them, and you have to do some self care and have time off. I leave anything out?
I mean, I think the most important thing is we've already said, and that is you don't want to just get kind of lost in the trees for the forest. The forest is the bigger picture of I'm doing this because I love this person and I want to help them live as well as I can for as long as I can. The trees are, I can't. I need to get you to the doctor's appointment by 10 o'clock, and you're being, you're lollygagging, and you're driving me nuts. And I'm trying to push you along, and I mean, ultimately, whether they get to the doctor's appointment at 10 o'clock or not, in the big scheme of things, doesn't matter. The big scheme of things, the forest is that they're going to be well cared for, and so you can't get. I know caregivers shouldn't be so intent on getting a specific task done, or that have their care receiver accept this specific piece of help. They have to just see them as a whole and understand that this is a process, and there's going to be give and take over time, and it'll evolve over time.
It can be messy. It's real life. It's just
It'll
not.
be messy. Exactly. Yeah. I like what you say about anticipating, because I think when we keep resisting the fact that they're resistant, and it ends up in constant frustration. If we start to get to the point where we kind of try to anticipate the reactions and do a little strategizing beforehand and prepare ourselves and prepare our approach, that can be really helpful, right?
To do that, you have to get your own emotions under better control. And then there, what I think Julie pointed out, when you're talking with someone else and they can give you their perspective, and just the very act of sharing what's frustrating you with somebody else will help you better get those frustrations under control. And then you can do that strategizing and enter the situation with a care receiver with more patience and more compassion.
This is how a lot of people use our Facebook group. They can post about this. You can vent in our group and people get it.
Oh,
And
yeah.
you'll get lots of supportive comments, as well as some practical tips and ways to approach it. And some people just say, okay, I feel so much better just to get that off my chest, just when they are writing. So I think, that's one of those great uses for your peer group, your support group, your Facebook group.
Oh, it feels so good to get even a little bit of care, a little
Yeah.
bit of validation. It makes a
Yeah.
big difference.
Validation. Yeah. And then one last question about this is, when how much do we let go of? So if a person's resisting, how, if the person is of sound mind and they are choosing to not accept certain aspects of care, at what point do you say, well, I've done the best I can and I can't keep pushing?
I mean, so you said of sound mind, meaning they have good judgment. And if they have good judgment, I mean, this is their lives ultimately, and it's their prerogative, however they want to run their lives. The more difficult situation is when people have some sort of cognitive issue. Maybe they have, outright dementia, and their judgment is poor, and then they're putting themselves in danger, and then you're trying to protect them from harming themselves, and they don't really understand what you're doing, other than it feels like you're taking over their lives. That is much more challenging. And so, but as much as possible, we want to preserve the person's dignity, but we also want to balance it with protecting their safety. That balance is very tough, and especially for folks caring for someone with dementia.
If they don't have dementia, though, if they're of sound mind, like you said, then I feel like it's also about the quality of life that they have. I know of someone who had lung cancer and then went back to smoking, and her daughter is frustrated by that, but the mom sneaks out and has a cigarette a few times a day. And if confronted, which she has been, the mother says, I need to do this. I love it. I'm not going to give it up. And so the daughter has to deal with the fact that maybe it will shorten her mother's life. Maybe she'll have a recurrence of cancer, but it's her life and it's her choice. And if it's so important for her to smoke, even if it feels selfish to the daughter, it's her right. My dad had diabetes, but I would take him to the supermarket and he'd buy beer and cookies. And I would say, how about some vegetables, maybe, something else. And I would have to accept that he could make choices about food. He had vascular dementia, but he was still of sound mind, basically. And you have to accept that it will not be perfect.
Yeah, another common example is when you have a parent who's living in their big house that they've lived in for 40 or 50 years, and it's way more house than they need, and maybe they're 3 stories. Going up and down the stairs is a pretty scary proposition for them every day. But if they're of sound mind and they don't want to move, and they are willing to take the risk of going up and down the stairs, I mean, you can speak your piece, but you have to respect that this is their decision. If they fall down the steps and they get hurt, well, then you're going to be there to help them. But hopefully that doesn't occur, and maybe long before that, hopefully you convince them to downsize.
And that's when there are things you can do to make the home safer. You
Yes.
can respect that decision and do things. Say, okay, well, if you want to stay in the home, then we're getting a stair lift, or we're moving your bedroom to the first floor, or sometimes there's some kind of bargaining room there. But then I think the thing that goes through a caregiver's mind is, but that's going to cause more work for me in the future, because you're going to be in the hospital, you're going to be getting chemo treatments, you have a broken hip, and that, I think that's where it kind of gets tough. And I don't know that the care recipient really can think of it that way. And you can go back to that, trying to, can you ease my stress in the future? And if this happens, here's what this means for me. And I have to take time off work, and, not in a resentful, mean way, but just in a practical way. So could we find a compromise here to make things a little safer?
I think that's very well said, Amy. And I mean, just another example that jumps to mind. My mother, she had to use a walker. She had chronic pain. She needed a walker. She didn't want to use a walker, right? It made her feel humiliated using the walker. Sometimes she would use a cane. But I would say to her, I've been to the emergency room with you a number of times now because you've had falls and needed to have x-rays to make sure you didn't break bones. I don't really want to do that again. And so my mother would kind of grudgingly give in a little bit, grudgingly, and use a walker, at least make believe to use a walker a little bit more often. But I think your point is well taken. I mean, they need to understand that their decisions have ramifications for other people, particularly the caregivers.
Yes, yes. All right, so I want to review everything we've said before we go to the other situation. We talked about having empathy, compassion, and understanding. We talked about starting small. Maybe they won't accept a caregiver every day, 24 hours a day, but maybe 3 times a week, or something like that. Enlist them to ease your stress, which we were just now talking about again. Uh, Understand that there is pride and a sense of self in being independent. I think that's one of the ones that it's really hard for people to accept. Like, if you have empathy and you put yourself in their position, it makes total sense. I wouldn't want someone to come in here today, to me, the way my life is right now, and say, well, you can't take care of that garden that you love so much, that brings you so much joy. You just need to leave. And when that's such an important part of my life, so help me find a way that I'm still going to have that joy in either a changed situation or get more help in the home, or whatever that is, that sense of independence. And then we talked about understanding, oops, that's the one I just said. We talked about that an objective person bringing someone else in might be a better way to approach it. And then that a family member, if they're resistant or hostile, understand, I can change myself, I can't change them. And do those things that are good for you, to take care of yourself. I think that's, uh, it takes a while for us people to get to that point of acceptance, doesn't it? Sometimes
I,
I get a lot of counseling sessions, huh?
Yes.
I think especially if you are trying to keep someone from falling and they fall, you feel guilty. I certainly felt guilty when my mother would fall. But the fact is, she wanted to live the way she wanted to live, and so long as she was of sound mind, as you point out, she had the right to fall, even though I didn't think it was such a good idea.
Even though
Yeah.
it interfered with our lives. Yeah.
Yes, yes. And so if those things are happening, we need to kind of anticipate those frustrations rather than, oh, she did it again. You're like, okay, I'm going over there. This is probably what's going to happen. Here's how I'm going to deal with it. And prepare yourself and practice that self-care, have outlets, talk it out, vent in the Facebook group, talk to your therapist, find people who understand. And of course, other caregivers are always the most understanding because we've lived it. And the last thing is to find compromise. Try to meet halfway. What's the way that we can work out an arrangement where we both feel better and our loved ones are safe or better cared for? So let's go on to our other end of the spectrum. So when we talk about people who are so demanding, and I realize that being demanding is kind of a subjective thing. What one person thinks is being too demanding, another might not. But when we as caregivers feel like my loved one is so demanding, they're just constantly asking me to do things. What do you do about that?
You can go.
All right, thank you.
Oh, sorry, I try to help and direct, but I don't always remember.
Yeah, you didn't mention we're husbands and wives, so we're used to
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Right, we're used to finishing each other's
Other sentences, yeah.
You got it. So, I mean, I think what we're talking about here is basically becoming comfortable with setting limits. That the person who's demanding may continue demanding no matter how much you do, and so you have to really figure out in your own mind what you're willing, able, and available to do, and that will be they may not meet what the other person's expectations are, and honestly, that's okay. I mean, and you don't have to do all the work yourself. Maybe you can find someone else to help. But just because a care receiver has expectations doesn't mean you have to meet them to the T. You have choices here, and we really encourage caregivers to make choices. The other thing I'll just say is care receivers' expectations maybe to be treated, with like royalty and being fed the finest food, etc. A lot of times those things have to do with whatever they did for their own parents or other care receivers in their lives, where they were in the caregiving role and they made all kinds of sacrifices and expect you're going to make the kind of sacrifices that they made. And that's not realistic, given that most families now, it's not a one income family, it's a two income family. So both spouses are out of the home, and they're not going to be. It's very difficult for one of the spouses to quit work and stay home. It does happen, but it means a loss of income for the family, and it's very hard in this day and age to get by on just one income. So there may be things that an earlier generation didn't face and doesn't take into account now. So there has to be maybe a conversation about what the caregiver's limits are and what they're also, again, willing to do, available to do, and able to do.
And sometimes the care receiver is an anxious person. And so their needs for someone to be with them all the time or to drive them places or take care of them excessively can come out of their own fears about their own safety, about being alone, about being frightened. So again, I would stress that we're depending on the care receiver. As a caregiver, you have to sort of evaluate what's going on with them and try to find a way to be empathic. Doesn't mean you become a doormat. It just means you want to understand why they have such big needs and why they feel like they can't handle things that you feel like they should be able to. And then also, just sort of like with the other topic, you look for compromise. So if someone says, I can't cook anymore, I just can't. And their daughter says, well, you actually could. You could at least microwave things, or, you could heat up a bowl of soup in a pot. I think you try to find things that they can do and help them have some confidence that you're still there. You're still caring for them. You'll be available. But again, they can help you by helping themselves. And they can also feel a little more confident if they do some things that they're afraid about.
I think that's such a good point, that the things that they're afraid about and the anxiety is another really good point of where it comes from. Is it a good idea to try and understand if they maybe do have clinical anxiety and need to be treated for that?
Yeah. I mean, one other very difficult situation that comes up where a care receiver may be too demanding is they want you and you only to do the work, right? And because they're more comfortable with you, they feel closer to you. Maybe you're the favorite child, um, but that doesn't mean that you're required to meet that expectation. Again, especially in a family where there may be multiple siblings, the parent may have a very strong preference for one of the children to do all the work, but that's not fair to that child. And it's not fair to the other siblings who may want to participate in the caregiving. And the idea here is if you want to help that parent meet their needs, it doesn't have to be done exactly in the manner that they want. You can say, we will spread the glory of caring for you, or we'll bring in other folks, personal care aides to help, but you're going to make sure you get the care that you need. Not necessarily have it all fall on one person's shoulders, even if that would make you most comfortable. And that gets back to the anxiety issue.
Yeah, they can be disappointed a little bit. You certainly can be disappointed as a caregiver. They can be a little disappointed as a care receiver. They will survive that, and it's okay.
That's such a good point because, for some of us, we don't want to disappoint them. We love them. We don't want them to be unhappy. And that's a really hard thing to do and that can go back through, I'm sure, for a lifetime of not wanting to disappoint your parents, especially if we're talking about parents. So, yeah, how do you cope with that? Being okay with disappointing them a little bit.
So, my experience is actually that people, you know, disappointment is kind of a common feature of family life. We're not perfect sons and daughters. We're not perfect parents. We do disappoint one another. We don't show up at the baseball game, or we don't remember to send the birthday card on time. I mean, we do disappoint, and that's, we forgive one another because we love one another and the bond is strong. And if we're not perfect in pleasing the person we're caring for during the caregiving years, it's not a crime. It means that we're family, and we're also all human, and we make mistakes, or we don't always agree on things. That's part of family life. And for the most part, that's always been part of family life.
That's such an important point, and that forgiveness is also a common part of family life, and to be okay with that. I remember one time, as you know, cared for my parents, and they lived with me. My mom lived with me just for one of the years, but dad for 6 years, and he had Alzheimer's. And I had rented an office because I couldn't work at home with him living there. And I was getting ready to go to my office. I had a paid caregiver with him who had been with us for a while and loved my dad. But nevertheless, I was more of his safety net. I was his person. And I said, well, Dad, I gave him a kiss and I'm going to the office now. And he got very upset and very sad and very, you are, I wish you would stay. Not like in a mean way, but in a very like desperate way. I wish you wouldn't go. I don't know what's going to happen. Well, he was just very upset. And I sat and talked to him for a little bit and said, here's what's going to happen. I'm going to go to my office and then I'm going to come back. And it's only going to be a few hours. And, so-and-so is going to be with you. And while I'm gone, here's what you're going to do. And then I'm going to come back and I'll have dinner with you. And just got him calmed down some. So finally he was like, well, okay, and that was so hard for me because I wanted to meet his every need. I wanted him to feel safe and secure. I wanted to be there for him, and I had to work, so sometimes he was disappointed, but he was fine, by the time I got home and everything. So those things can be emotionally difficult for us as caregivers.
Oh, definitely. But I love your story because he got over it. His disappointment passed. Once you were at your office, he was probably fine with the caregiver that he knew for years, like you said, who cared about him. So we might overinterpret how disappointed our loved one is in a certain situation, or assume it's going to go on and torture them for hours, where it really could be passing. It might have been even, I don't know, but it might have been just the separation that made your dad sort of have this upset
It
reaction.
reminded me of separation anxiety that people talk about when they drop their children off at daycare or that type of thing. Sometimes that happens. And yes, he had Alzheimer's, he had dementia, but there are many people who don't have dementia who still feel that way, like you say, who only want you because they feel safe and comfortable with you. It's not because they want to make your life miserable. It's because that's their safety and their sense of comfort and their dignity. I think you talked about that with your mother, Barry, that you know there's for some people they only want a family member to help them with personal care, but for some people that's the last thing they want because it doesn't seem right, and it's better to have a professional do that. So you kind of have to try and figure out and understand what your loved one wants, right?
I think that's where you start, and you see what they need, and also what their preferences are. And I think the example you just gave is a great one
Mhm.
because, as you know, there are people who don't want anybody in the home, and there are people who don't want their son showering them, right? And so it's going to vary. But
Yeah.
we talk a lot about dignity in the new book, the AARP Caregiver Answer Book, because dignity kind of lays a foundation for much better compromises here, much better negotiations for all these things, and really helps preserve the love that we want caregiving to reinforce.
Mhm.
Um, and when dignity breaks down, when people begin treating one another harshly, then caregiving is not nearly as joyous and could potentially harm family relationships, and
Yeah.
we don't want that.
I think of the caregivers who relate, I turn my, I leave work, I work hard to get to this doctor's appointment, I turn my life upside down, and then they decide at the last minute they don't want to go. And then I reschedule the appointment, and then it happens again. And the people it's gone on and on and on and on, and they feel like they're at the end of their rope. How do you decide what kind of a limit or boundary you're going to put on it? I mean, in that situation, you probably aren't going to be able to say, "I'm never going to take you to a doctor appointment again." But what do you do? Like one of the things I did was because it was just hard to get my parents out because of all of those things, not because they were resistant, they were just slow and just issues. I started using mobile doctors to come into the home, and that actually helped us out quite a bit. um, how do you decide what those limits are?
You do your best. That's all you can do. So if
Hmm.
want mom to go to the doctor or she has an appointment and won't do it and you reschedule, won't do it. I think you should anticipate that she won't do it the third time too, you know? And so you go in saying, are we doing this today or do we need to cancel? You can't have, it can't be something that is being done for you as a caregiver. It's really your mother who needs the care. And either she's going to go to the doctor or not. If you can get a mobile doctor in, that is an excellent idea. Some places, you can't. And so you try to work with her. If she has dementia, you might say, we're going out to lunch and then take her to a meal, but also to the doctor. Like once she's in the car, it gets a little bit easier to maneuver, but you cannot always succeed and you are likely to fail. And that has to be okay. It's part of caregiving. It just
Hmm.
is.
We already mentioned we talk a lot about that every caregiver has choices about how much they do and also how they do whatever they're ready to commit to, and that's based on what they're willing to do, what they're able to do, and what they're available to do. So I keep coming back to this example of a parent who falls because it is common, and I dealt with it with my mom a lot, and my stepfather for that matter. Not everybody's able to pick up someone from the ground, right? And my mother might be on the ground. She says, "No, don't call the police again. They're irritated with me every time we call them. You got to figure out a way to pick me up." But it's like I have a bad back, and it wasn't so easy. And so, um, at a certain point, caregivers have to really appreciate their own limits as to what they can do. They have to, as in your case, you got to work, you got to earn money, and you're not going to be able to be there 24/7, tied tied to the care receiver. And there may be times when you just need to replenish yourself and not be there and do other things. And so there's caregivers have the ability to define what they're going to do. And it's not going to, it oftentimes is not going to really neatly fit what care receivers want. And the fit's going to be a little bit off, but at the end of the day, hopefully the care receiver's needs will be met, and the caregiver will have been a good enough caregiver, not a perfect caregiver.
Yeah. I think about a scenario where that has actually kind of both, resisting and being too demanding. I have a friend whose mom resists doing exercises, and my mom didn't like to do exercises either. So she gets weaker. So then she's more demanding of them to do things for her. And that's kind of like the vicious circle of it. You resist doing things, but then you're more demanding of having them come and do things for you and help you to the bathroom and do things that you think, well, if she'd do her exercises, she could do them more. So I think I love going back to what you had both said about empathy, about understanding where they come from. At what point do they reach a point where they really can't do it? They just are not able to muster up the energy, the understanding. It's too painful, whatever it is, and they just aren't going to do it. They can't do it. So we have to sometimes come to a point of acceptance in that sense too, that my caregiving is getting more intense now because they've reached a point where we might be able to get her to do some things for herself, and we have to absolutely try to keep doing those. But I need to start accepting the fact that this is inevitably going to happen.
One of the biggest, most difficult things that we have to do as caregivers is learn how to accept what's in front of us. Yes, if mom isn't going to do her exercises, she has the right not to. And if it's going to have a bigger impact on us, okay, then we need to try to anticipate how we're going to cope with that, whether it's bringing in other people or finding a facility for her or whatever it is we need to do to try to keep her safe. Ultimately, we can only try to keep someone safe. So the accepting that this person is diminishing, that they are, if she doesn't want to exercise, it may be because it causes pain. It might be exhausting. It might be that she can't move her body the way she used to. We don't really know what goes into the decisions that people make.
Mm-hmm.
Can't really get in their head, but we can try to understand that they have a right to make a decision, even if it's one that we think is bad. And we try to keep them safe. We try to negotiate. And then at some point, like you're saying, we have to accept it. And we have to say to ourselves, our job is to give them the best life that they want, that they prefer, not what we want for them. And
right.
it's
really hard to do that sometimes. Yes, so hard to do that.
Yeah, and I just want to add one thing. I mean, I would say, that's right. We want to provide the best life for them that they would want, not necessarily what we want for them, but also taking into account our own limitations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We are
so
limited.
you have to balance it.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, that's so tricky. So let's go over some of the things we've talked about with the person who we feel like is asking us to do unreasonable things or too many things and maybe not in a demanding manner, but it feels demanding. So first of all, we talked about setting limits and healthy boundaries. We talked about enlisting help from others. So I can't meet all the needs. And so I'm going to coordinate and find other people to help fill those gaps. We talked about that it may be related to how they cared for their family members, which was such a good point that you made, Barry, that, maybe they weren't working and they were caring for their parent. And now I'm working at which, 60% of family caregivers are doing. And I just don't have the time or ability to do the same kinds of things or the things that I'd like to do for you, but I can't. So here's how we're going to find another way to deal with it. We talked about demanding behaviors may come from a place of anxiety. So try to understand why they're being demanding. What is it that's causing them to want only you, or to want this situation or that situation, or to avoid going to a doctor, or to avoid stopping driving? What are their fears and anxieties, and then see if there's something that can be treated around that, of course. And I know you've probably talked with a lot of your clients about that. How do I know if it's clinical anxiety my loved one has or not? How do you get them evaluated?
Take
Barry, you
them
want
to
to? Yeah,
their
either one of you.
the primary care doctor can evaluate them. They can also get an appointment with a psychiatric specialist, and literally have an evaluation, and preferably someone, if they're an older person, that understands geriatric care, so that the medications they might decide to put them on are safe and won't lead to more falls, that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Right.
we always start with a primary care provider
Yeah.
because it's usually someone with whom they have a relationship already. It's not as stigmatizing as going to a mental health professional. But absolutely, if the primary care provider says, I'd like you to see a psychiatric nurse or a psychiatrist, because I think it will be helpful to you, I'm hoping that the family will follow through on that recommendation. And as because when anxiety is under better control, a lot of these family relations
Much better.
go
Yeah.
better. Yeah, and
Much better. Yes, yeah. Both my parents ended up needing some help with that. And
Mhm.
as we age, our brains change, our chemistry changes, health conditions can cause problems, dementia can cause. I had a geriatric psychiatrist that helped with my dad's medications, who helped with both his dementia medications, but also an anxiety medication. That because the geriatric psychiatrists know an older person's brain so well and how they react to these medications. So I think that's great advice. And then we talked about looking for compromise. I can't do everything, but I can do this much. And trying to find out, and trying to stay calm, I think, in these conversations is critical, probably. And then the last thing we talked about was um, when they want you and only you to care for them, it doesn't mean you're required to meet that expectation. Do what you can and fill the gaps with others. And I think the follow up thing you said was so critical, that if they're disappointed, it's not the end of the world. It's okay, and it's a normal part of life, and so is forgiveness. And I think that's one of the hardest difficult things. I just realized I misspelled accept. So to get to that point of accept the situation, because after you think through all these other things, maybe you can get to a point where I accept the situation and I know what's going to be coming.
yeah, and then unfortunately, as you pointed out earlier, the situation changes and often gets worse, and you have to accept more
More
and
and more.
maybe grieve more of what's
Yeah,
been.
right. All right, so we have a few questions from the Facebook group, and so I wanted to go through those. We had someone who asked, how long is it safe for someone not to wash up who has chronic UTI? So, in other words, someone who's resisting bathing, how do you deal with that?
Okay. So, I mean, I'm not a physician, but I worked in medicine for almost 30 years. I mean, the answer to the first part of that question is um, UTIs are not simply caused by not bathing. It's also caused by anatomical changes that occur with aging, and often a combination of the two, or the habits that people have when they use the bathroom. And
And it's also they're finding gut health and
Mhm.
other issues. So it's not just about how they wipe and all of those things, but they can talk to a doctor about that. That
they absolutely have something with that.
bathing, because that is a really common one.
Yes.
Resisting bathing.
Um, and in terms of getting someone to bathe who's resistant to bathing, this is not unusual for people with dementia. Um, we had talked earlier about sometimes people will be more polite and more cooperative with someone outside the family. So bringing in a personal care aide, especially someone with experience with people with dementia and who has experience bathing people who may be reluctant, that we've seen that work very well, and really creates a great sense of relief. But the other part of this is the family needs to accept probably less bathing than more. I mean, if you get the person to take a shower or a bath once a week, you're doing pretty well.
Mhm.
And maybe that's not what this person's typical habits had been in the past, but it may be the best you're going to do right now. So that's another component of acceptance.
And I think and I know this from personal experience with my dad and with other family members, look at why they're resisting bathing, because one of the difficult things is being cold. And so make that bathroom as warm as you possibly can. I got a little space heater and then eventually had one put in the ceiling. I got a towel warmer for as soon as dad got out. I got a big towel with a hood that we could put on him right away. Are they feeling unsafe in the bathroom? So do you need some kind of a difference in terms of a shower chair, grab bars, any of the things that would make them feel uncomfortable or unsafe to do bathing, I think are really critical here too. Julia, you
Yeah,
had something to add?
I think there's another piece too, which is that sometimes this may sound silly, but to strip naked feels very vulnerable if
Yeah.
you are easily confused and disoriented. And so I think the more gentle the caregiver can be about all this, I love all these ideas of keeping them warm and definitely grab bar, shower chair. If you can do a hand shower,
Yeah,
extension.
the hand shower especially is good because, as you say, the dignities, sometimes you can have them cover themselves with a towel and only use the hand shower on the part of the body you're washing at the time. And then it limits the time that you're completely exposed. And that
Yeah.
can be helpful.
And they
Yeah.
can feel a little bit less vulnerable that way. And, it's not like you want to torture them. You just want them clean. So,
Hmm.
and if it's
Yeah,
not possible,
yeah, I was just going to say the other thing is that sometimes if you just target, okay, I'm just going to wash the personal parts, and that we don't have to be completely everywhere, but the critical areas that need to be cleaned, we're going to just do those. It takes less time. You're not sweating a lot, you're not running marathons, you
yeah.
know and sometimes people are better with that, like what my mom always called a spit bath. Right. Okay, so another question we have here, is if a person is demanding and it's not a necessity to have what they are demanding done, do you think they can understand that it can wait?
It depends on them. Do they have dementia where they may not understand? Or um, if the only way you can find out if they'll understand is you ask them. You say, I understand that you want this and that you want it right away. We can only do it at this time instead of the time you want. Can you tolerate that? I'll be with you and we'll try to tolerate it together, but it's not going to happen right away. So a conversation can help.
Yes. And Barry, you had mentioned to me at one point in our conversations something about their sense of time may actually be off.
Yeah, so I was mentioning that I had worked years ago with a family where an older gentleman had had a right brain stroke affecting the left part of his body, and his sense of time was off. He couldn't estimate how long things took, and just as an experiment, and also to demonstrate this to his wife, I said to him, "I'd like you to estimate how long 60 seconds are, and I'm going to put a stopwatch on, and when you think we've reached 60 seconds, you tell me." And I said, "Go," and I then he said, "Stop," and I showed him the stopwatch, and it was 13 seconds. And I mean, I don't think any of us would get 60 seconds exactly, but for someone whose sense of time is so distorted that they think 13 seconds, it means that a whole minute has elapsed, then they're going to be very impatient because they don't get it that things take time. They're going to be very impatient because their whole sense of time is off. So
Right.
neurological changes can affect their perception and then affect the interaction with the people caring for them.
And impulse
Sometimes,
too. Like if they have lobe damage, they can be very impulsive and they can't really control wait. They can't wait easily. They can't think things through. So an increase in impulsivity is really challenging too.
and that can come with mental health conditions, that can come with stroke, dementia, various types of health conditions. And as we were talking about before, anxiety can just make everything seem urgent.
Mhm.
So, yeah, they may not be understanding that it can wait. So, try to get to the bottom of what's causing that feeling of it has to be done right now. Okay, here's another one. What if you have a person in their life that interferes with your loved one's care? For example, your loved one resists care, and when they are with this other person, that person refuses to do or monitor that care, saying they just don't think they can do it, or they don't think that, that they think it's too much for them, even though that's what the doctor's orders are, and that person should, so in other words, the person's resisting it, and another caregiver is reinforcing that, basically.
I mean, obviously that's a problem, and it's far better for all the caregivers, the whole caregiving team, to present a united front and to be reinforcing consistent messages. And if the person who thinks that it's not that the care receiver doesn't need the care, or the caregiver shouldn't be forceful with them, there has to be a conversation among the caregivers before they ever interact with the care receiver. They need to get on the same page, and if they can't get on the same page, then maybe they need an outside like a physician or a therapist or something. We do sometimes, where we meet with family members and help them better understand kind of what care receiver's condition is, what their needs are, and then how to provide those needs. Without that consensus, things could go awry pretty quickly.
This is a very common problem because one caregiver lives, let's say, with the parent. The other one lives across the country. And when they call, the parent sounds okay. When they visit, the parent's adrenaline's kind of going because they're excited to see this adult child that they don't usually see. They do better. And then that person leaves, and, they go downhill, and the caregiver who lives there has to kind of clean up. And so these two caregivers have a very different perspective of their parent. And so what we would say is, when there are reports from the doctor, when there are tests that you can share, as the caregiver, you want to do that. You want to try to pull in this other person who maybe doesn't see what you see, and get them to see that the medical results are showing this. You could also take a video of when she's doing badly. Like, there are ways to try to get the person to see what's in front of you, even though they don't always get to see that.
And also talk about the repercussions. If they don't do this, this is what we anticipate can happen. Because some people, and I had this, and I don't think my sister would mind me talking about this, when we started together taking care of our parents, I was trained as a music therapist. I worked in an adult daycare center. My whole background had me trained to help support people in being as independent as possible. So if you can do it, I'm not going to do it for you, because if you don't use it, you lose it. And she felt like taking care of someone meant doing things for them. And so we at first had some conflicts around that. And then she started understanding, why that was my approach to it. And she got very good at it. But she said she hadn't even realized that was kind of her approach to it. So I think sometimes other family members, that might be too much for them, because they feel like that's not being kind to them and taking care of them, where they have to understand the long-term effects of them not doing, resisting the things that are ultimately good for them. All right, we have one more. I don't know if this is resisting care, she says, but I never understood why my husband refused certain aspects of hospice care, like a hospital bed. He absolutely would not have one. I finally told him, you're getting one because you can't get up any longer, and that's it. He got into it on a Monday, went into a coma, and passed 36 hours later. I just think he would have been so much more comfortable than he was, but he wouldn't have it. So I guess the question is, why did he resist it? Did it signify the end for him?
It may have signified the end. That is a very significant emotion. Just fear of the end, and fear of admitting how bad things are. The other is humiliation. Being in a hospital bed, using a walker. There are things that are kind of symbols of dependency that people don't want to subject themselves to. They want to avoid them because they're trying to save face as much as possible, and they don't want to feel humiliated. And so the husband may have felt that once he went into a hospital bed, it was going to be the end. So he was not going to be himself. He had slept in his bed, maybe with his spouse forever, and maybe he wanted to continue doing that until the end and not be separated from her in a hospital bed where he's now a hospital type patient. And so a lot of feelings that can come up there.
And the hospital bed is often in the middle of a living room or something. It's not always in a bedroom, and that can feel very exposed. But I can't help feeling for the person who wrote this question. how sad for you that you wanted him to be more comfortable, and you finally, convince him, you get him into this bed, and then he passes away. I hope you don't feel guilty. It's not your fault. This was his time, and you did a loving thing. You wanted him to be comfortable.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yes, I think that it's the same thing as when, you know, our older generations thought of going to a care home meant that's where you went to die. And I remember my grandmother talking like that. Now we have other options like assisted living and independent living and various, kinds of care options that, that are across the spectrum that don't necessarily mean that. And the same thing with hospice. People put that off for so long because they feel like, well, then that means I'm giving up, I'm dying. When actually it's just more assistance and help for the family. And statistically, people actually live longer and more comfortable lives. They actually live a bit longer with hospice care because they're getting such good comfort care. These are all really tricky situations. Thank you so much for offering all of your advice and answers. And I want to talk about your new book because you actually have additional answers for people. Tell us about the book.
So the book is a book length FAQ. It's written in question and answer format, the entire book, and it has nearly 150 questions and answers. The questions are questions which caregivers have posed to us for the last 30 plus years, whether it be our psychotherapy clients or our neighbors or our friends or our family members or our colleagues. Just people, the same questions come up again and again. And the book has 13 chapters covering a whole wide range of topics, from everything from caregiving for parents, spouses, dealing with siblings, partnering with healthcare professionals, managing finances, and dealing with end of life caregiving, and many other topics. But the idea is putting it in question and answer format means that people can find questions that are, once they see the question, that is a question that they have also, they're going to feel validated. And then we try to provide as pragmatic an answer as we can, things that people can use in their lives right away, and will help them better manage what is a difficult challenge oftentimes of being a good caregiver.
Yeah. Julie, can you tell us what some of the categories of questions are in the book?
There are questions about how do you get your siblings to participate more or to stop fighting with them? How do you get your spouse with dementia to grieve with you about the dementia? There are questions about safety. Don't leave things on the stairs. Add lighting. Don't have things to trip over. Very practical things. How to talk to a professional when you go to the doctor with your loved one. Does the doctor only talk to them and ignore you, or only talk to you and ignore them? How do you work with that? A lot of new caregivers feel overwhelmed because they don't know the medical jargon. They don't understand the illness that their loved one has. They don't know how long it's going to take. So we try to help them get answers to those questions. Either we answer them or we help them find out how to get answers. Because our goal, you can see the book right behind me.
I was
It
going to
is
say, do you want to show us the book?
it's it's a roadmap for caregivers, and you can see on it there's a picture of a road. So it's really anything you need. If you're a new caregiver, it even helps you define, what does that mean? What does it mean to be a caregiver? What am I going to be responsible for? How do I decide what my limits are? Can I do this? Is it going to be too hard for me? Are there things I absolutely won't do? And then we go through the whole process of caregiving to the very end, where even after the caregiving is over, how does the caregiver grieve? How does the caregiver take care of him or herself and kind of figure out what their identity is, because it's so all consuming? How do they move on from it? So our goal is to help caregivers as much as we can. And we hope that, when they use this kind of as a resource, they will feel like they can do it. They'll feel confident and capable.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for writing the book. And folks, you can get it on the AARP website, or you can go to caregiveranswerbook.com. I'll put a link in the comments with the direct link to the book. And Barry and Julia are welcome to go in and add comments with your other contact links. We hope you'll do that. And again, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this incredible new tool, but also answering some of these really difficult questions for family caregivers. And I also want to say thank you to all the caregivers joining us today. If you have other questions, just drop them in the comments. We'll get back to you and try to answer your questions. And again, if you're not already a member of the AARP Family Caregivers Discussion Group on Facebook, please do join us in the group. So everyone have a great day and take care.
Thank you, Amy.
Bye bye.